When I first saw this thumbnail from Food Theories, my first thought was, did MatPat steal my video from 5 months ago? And well, there are some similarities in the video, like the stupid joke about seafood being bees now.
Sushi will never be the same.
In order of our restaurant's finest fish and chips. Nicolas Cage.
Bees the whole time.
No, not the bees! Not the bees!
You're in California, Dad.
Not the bees! Ah! Oh, my eyes! My eyes! Ah!
B-movie references.
Absurd bee-related legal case to ever hit a courtroom.
What exactly is your relationship?
Perhaps in an attempt to demonstrate the effectiveness of the American legal system. And laughing at Bumblebee names.
Crotch's Bumblebee lives in only 20...
And the ridiculous names of the bumblebees like Crotch Bumblebee and Sakikaku Bumblebee. But it's pretty clear from the start that the theorist team didn't find my article or video. Because MatPat, which from here on I will use to refer to the theorist team because the STS is hard on my Southeast Asian tongue, said this.
But of course, all these legal gymnastics started to take my brain into some weird areas. I wanted to take this absurd premise to its logical conclusion. Like, alright, if bees are legally qualified as fish now, that means that bee farms should technically have to pay the fees and pass many of the inspections associated with fish farms and fish hatcheries.
Which is false. In the Californian law, bees are only considered fish for the purposes of conservation. This is the first thing I said immediately after the first dumb joke in my video. The reason why bees are now legally considered fish in the state of California is so that they can be protected as endangered and threatened species. You aren't actually gonna be eating bees and chips in California. At least, I think you don't. In fact, in the very first article that MatPat links, the Chief Justice Tanikantil Sakui said that grouping bees as fish is only done to clarify the ambiguities in the Endangered Species Act, and that the decision should not be misconstrued as an affirmative determination by this court that under the law, bumblebees are fish. Which would make the video more like animal theory, but I digress. I should also clarify that I do like MatPat, and I don't think some of their content is bad. But I am very salty right now, considering that their video got 700,000 views in less than 1 day, yet my video only got 66 views after 5 months, despite apparently having a greater integrity for fact-checking. In any case, this makes it a good opportunity to fact-check MatPat, given that I had already done the same research and more. Here's what happened according to MatPat.
You see, back in 2018, several environmental and animal protection groups brought a petition to the California State Fish and Game Commission, asking them to add 4 specific subspecies of bumblebee to the list of officially protected animals under the California Endangered Species Act. Sounds easy enough, right? Especially since there are very specific criteria for determining whether or not a species qualifies for protected status. And wouldn't you know, the group came packing stats that backed their petition up. For instance, one fact they cited was that Crotch's Bumblebee lives in only 20% of its original historic range across the region, and is said to have declined 98% in relative abundance.
The explanation for the actual case is true, but for the sake of fact-checking, according to the petition they sent to the State of California Fish and Game Commission, there were actually 2 measures of ranges, one using a recent time period between 2002 and 2012, and the other one using from 1805 to 2001. The 20% is gotten from a rounding error from 20.48% and uses the period between 1805 to 2001. MatPat proceeds to give a good explanation for how CISA affects land ownership in California. Something important because a lot of farms in California are family farms. What is also important to note is that although most of these are small farms, when we count by area, most of the agricultural land in California is actually owned by big agriculture, which is something to be discussed later.
You see, the California Endangered Species Act, or CISA for short, is one of the most powerful individual state endangered species acts in the United States, because in an effort to protect animals and their habitats, it gives the government the power to impose severe restrictions on what private landowners can and can't do with their land. So this one case isn't just protecting animals, it's a decision that affects anyone and everyone who might be trying to buy, lease, build on, or use land and its resources. If a protected animal hangs out in your area, or winds up deciding it wants to use your area, well, you are out of luck, my friend. Suddenly, the land that you own becomes useless because a bee needs to waggle on a nearby flower. And the more land you own, the more of a threat this sort of regulation becomes. Enter California's immensely powerful agriculture and farming industry, or more specifically, the combined forces of the Almond Alliance, the Cotton Ginners, the Association of Pest Control, the Citrus Mutual, and the Farm Bureau Federation, as well as a few others. Basically, it's an Avengers-level team-up of industry lobbying organizations, and they did not want the bumblebees of officially classified as a threatened species. Why? Because doing so would likely increase limits on land use, pesticide use, and take all the investments that they've made in huge chunks of land and make those investments largely worthless. That means finding new land, spending more money, and at the end of the day, raising the cost of almonds for millions of people in the country who buy them, as well as the 3 people left who still eat Almond Joy candy bars.
MatPat isn't wrong in the explanation that a classification for bumblebees will make costs for almonds go up for many people, but it wouldn't make their investments in the land worthless, just worth less. Very important distinction between value going to 0, worthless, and value dropping by 10 or 20%, worth less. The explanation that the Alliance is an Avengers level team up is also troubling, because it gives the impression that they are good guys here and grossly misrepresents how unsustainable agriculture practices are in California. We will get back to this unsustainability later and let MatPat explain the rest of the legal case first.
So in order to avoid this, they evoked one of food theory's favorite tactics, a legal technicality, arguing before the courts that bees couldn't be listed as an endangered species, not because the data about their population or habitat status was wrong, but because the Endangered Species Act, as written and signed into law, is meant to protect, quote, bird, mammal, fish, amphibian, reptile, or plant. Notice something missing? Yep. Insects aren't mentioned anywhere in the text of CISA, nor are arachnids, crustaceans, millipedes, most invertebrates, really. But you get the idea. It doesn't exclude them, but it also doesn't make mention of them either. So that was the basis of the case. Hold on, you might be thinking to yourself, how could this not have come up before? After all, the California Endangered Species Act was enacted in 1970. We pull a lot of insect-adjacent invertebrates like lobsters, shrimp, crabs, and mollusks out of the water as seafood. So someone must have been concerned about an invertebrate at some point during the last 40 years, right? Well, yeah. In 1969, 1 year before CISA was enacted, California's separate Fish and Game Code Section 45 broadened the legal definition of fish to include, quote, wild fish, mollusk, crustacean, invertebrate, or amphibian. But in doing this, they actually legally opened up yet another magical technicality of the law. As written, the text of the code says that fish is defined as invertebrate, i.e. an animal without a spine. In other words, 97% of all living things on the planet. Based on the context, you can tell that it was meant to be aquatic invertebrate specifically, but that's not what it explicitly says. A loophole is a loophole after all, and bureaucracy is gonna bureaucracy. Based purely on what the letter of the California law technically says, the legal definition of fish can encompass anything without a backbone. Insects are invertebrates, bees are insects, therefore bees are fish, alongside its other fellow fishy friends like butterflies, earthworms, and spiders. So yeah, after some back and forth decisions on appeals between 2018 and now, bumblebees are officially fish in the state of California.
The details of the case are generally correct, but as previously explained, bees being considered fish is only for the purposes of conservation. So MatPat's 1-minute ramble, which I won't include in this video, on honey being seafood and requiring a fishing license is all wrong.
That said, of all the weird tangents that this research took me down, it was the Rent-A-Bee service that really caught me the most off guard. You heard that right, renting bees. Farmers will pay to have bees come over to their farms to help pollinate their crops. It's called paid pollination services, and it's becoming increasingly important to farming. Heck, there are even people named pollination brokers who act as go-betweens, whose job is to coordinate everything it takes to bring thousands of bees across state lines just so they can arrive right in time for pollination season. Why is something like this necessary? Well, exactly what we've been talking about here today. A lower population of certain types of bees coupled with a greater demand for certain types of crops that need greater pollination services. And wouldn't you know, but the most dependent industry on these bee rental services is none other than the almond growers of California. Yep, our dear friend from the legal case, the Hawkeye of the agricultural Avengers. He needs the bees more than anyone else. More than half of the US's total amount of honeybees, in fact. Between almond milk, butter, almond snacks, all of it, the demand for almonds has exploded. And California, the epicenter of our lawsuit, happens to be responsible for 100% of the US's almonds and 80% of all almonds grown worldwide. Yep, that's right. 80% of the world's almonds are coming from California, and there just aren't enough bees in California to sustain all those almonds.
Aside from the Hawkeye references, the facts are largely correct.
Which has me asking the question, why then are they part of this coalition looking to shut down bee protections in the first place? They'd rather just rent a bunch of bees? So I looked into it. Maybe these 4 subspecies of bee are just the wrong types of bee to be protecting.
MatPat asked the correct question, but went about the wrong way in finding the answer. Because MatPat had assumed that all bees are similar to the honeybee where they live in hives and produce honey. But the thing is, most of the bees in North America are solitary and 70% of them live in the ground. Less than 4% of all bee species actually even make honey. What this means is that commercializing them in farms is difficult in the first place, and people are still researching ways to make them viable. Also, the fact that their population is declining at a rapid rate may make commercializing them a bit difficult considering that most of them are dead. MatPat then cites studies saying that native bumblebees and honeybees work well together, and that bumblebee pollinated almond trees produce more fruit than honeybee pollinated trees. Well, actually they didn't cite them rather than just saying that there are such studies, which is troubling. Given that they didn't give the sources, and my confidence in their research reliabilities is already rather low, seeing that they wasted 2 minutes in the video because they didn't read 2 sentences in the first article they showed in the video. But I do know that there are links to the research papers for the video I produced 5 months ago. For instance, there is this study here, which supports the claim that wild pollinators do the job more effectively. Or this article by the Research Institute of Organic Agriculture saying that only a few hundred mason bees are required to pollinate the same hectare of apple or almond trees, which would normally require tens of thousands of honeybees. More importantly, the oversimplification from MatPat's answer meant that they didn't mention native bees having been displaced by commercial honeybees, being forced to change the suite of flowers they visit, reduce their reproductive success, and that honeybees tended to spread diseases and pathogens to native bees. Which is to say that the fairy tale ending MatPat suggests of Big Almond working together with conservationists and everybody including the bees benefit is a bit hard to achieve today. Because the current situation is pretty urgent to say the least. And we know that because the current arrangement doesn't even benefit the honeybees. Natural honeybees don't usually only feed on almond pollen and nectar, but the almond industry kind of forces them to a monoculture. Honeybees undergoing the stress of transport were also recorded to have the ability to nurse the next generation of workers affected, recorded to have a significant decrease in lifespan, higher oxidative stress levels, and hives experience considerable temperature stress, which is an important component of annual colony losses. By annual colony losses, I mean that over the 2018 to 2019 winter, roughly 50 billion honeybees have died. Or as one farmer in this Guardian article disclosed, is losing 30% or more of his bees a year, which is compared to the 5% per year due to disease or weather before this. This 30% is pretty standard numbers nowadays. You have honeybees dying from varroa mite, new and emerging diseases like the Israeli acute paralysis virus, pesticides, stress, poor nutrition, and sometimes you even have worker bees just literally disappearing for nobody knows why and leaving the queen alone, causing entire hives to collapse. Watching MatPat's video, you may also get the impression that California's almond industry is some kind of superhero organization working hard to provide affordable almonds for the entire world. Sure, at the cost of ecological failure, or the cost that many farm workers earn less than minimum wage due to the seasonality of the job and are generally undocumented immigrants. Or that California is the state that has the greatest number of households with food insecurity. Or that certain large corporations like the Wonderful Company had aggressively consumed water and expanded their business in California, causing irreversible damages to the water ecosystem. Which I should mention that right now, California is still having water shortages. Look, I don't know how much MatPat loves almonds, considering the strange position they have in the video. But the question is, are those worth the cost of cheap almonds? Especially given that almond isn't even a staple food like rice or bread, or when there are substitutes like soy or oat milk, which has less emissions, land use and water use. Is that really how the Avengers of agriculture operate? I don't like Marvel movies, but last I checked, the Avengers weren't the guys who cared only about profits. And then, by the end of the video, MatPat says,
Are solutions where everyone, including the bees, get a little of what they want. No fish required.
Except this is also wrong. This bumblebee story is actually a repeat of a similar story from before on a fish called the Delta smelt, which has, by the way, already functionally gone extinct. The same exact story, conservationists versus farmers, and legal battles fought over it for nearly half a century. We do need the fish! The Delta smelt is something called an indicator species, meaning it can somewhat represent the health of the Delta ecosystem, the health of which is in disarray, like disappearing Chinook salmon, decreased water levels, toxic algal blooms, or increasing invasive species kind of disarray. Let's just say that as an average almond enjoyer, watching the price of almond go up is a very small price to pay. To get the full story on the Delta smelt, I recommend Sakamistron's 45-minute documentary. And for a more complete picture of the bee story, obviously my pity poo video from 5 months ago. But given that this is a fact check, there's still one last place that we skipped over just now.
In 1893, a grocer named John Nix wanted to avoid a tax on vegetables and argued that his tomatoes were fruit. He wasn't wrong either. A tomato is a ripened flower ovary that contains seeds. That is exactly what a fruit is. But the courts didn't care about that. Ultimately, they decided that the tomato was a vegetable and that John Nix needed to pay his taxes.
The John Nix case is well documented on Wikipedia, and at least using a non-lawyer background, the facts are mostly correct.
There was also a time in the 17th century when the Catholic Church considered beavers to be fish. In the lead up to Easter, the Catholic Church discourages its members from eating meat on Fridays. But the Bishop of Quebec argued that beaver meat could be acceptable because it was such a good swimmer. The Catholic Church was like, sounds good enough to me. And so the beaver became a fish and its meat was deemed acceptable for eating on Fridays during Lent. They actually did the same thing with the capybara as well. According to the church, this swimming rodent right here, also a fish.
But the beaver story is half correct. The same claim that the whole beaver was eaten is also found on Scientific American and Atlas Obscura, but going to Wikipedia, we find that only the tail is actually eaten, because the beaver is considered part mammal and part fish, with the scaly fish-like tail being the fish part. Wikipedia's source is the book Beaver by Rachel Poliquin, which says that the belly and tail were deemed fish and could be eaten on days of fasting. And the source this book got the information from is Fast and Feast, Food in Medieval Society by Bridget Ann Hanisch. And here, we learn that monks had developed a skill of looking for loopholes to escape the rule about not eating meat, and that the rule had been growing less strict over the centuries. During Lent, the church didn't relax the meat-eating rule, but ultimately, they decided that the beaver's tail, being covered with scales, looked distinctly fishy. Notably, there isn't any mention of the time, about 17th century. Rather, the source is rather ambiguous, only mentioning Middle Ages. MatPat most likely got their source from the Scientific American, given that the article mentions 17th century and also mentioned the capybara here. Fast and Feast mentions a John Russell in the 15th century listing a dish of beaver tail for consideration in the Recipe and Manners book, Book of Nature. The tail of a beaver is mentioned here under How to Carve a Fish, but there's no mention of the church regarding the beaver. Sadly, the Scientific American didn't exactly give their sources, only with a disclaimer that the views expressed are those of the author and not necessarily those of the Scientific American. For whatever reason, this particular article referenced Wikipedia in the links, so we're basically back full circle. And our investigation ends here. We did confirm that at least part of the beaver, its tail, was considered fish in the Middle Ages, but not the date when the church declared it okay. In any case, MatPat's Bees Are Fish video isn't exactly well researched. Perhaps this kind of shortcut taking is just what it takes to be a big YouTuber with 4 channels. But I'm just a fat boy, a fact-checking fat boy.